People know me as a lover of hard rock and heavy metal. So why am I doing the album ranking of the pop artist Phil Collins? Well, not only was he a mega selling artist in the 80s, but of course, he's the drummer and the lead singers of one of the greatest bands ever, Genesis. So let's see whether Phil Collins' pop career was anywhere as near as good as his Genesis one. Let's get ready for the Phil Collins album ranking. Welcome back to Rocker's Beer Review. Today we're going a slightly off-piste with the rock album ranking. With today's one is going to be Phil Collins. Now, hopefully a lot of you know, I mean, if you've watched the channel, you know I'm a big fan of prog rock, and Genesis being one of those bands. And obviously Phil Collins, megastar with Genesis, drummer from 1970, became the lead vocalist from 1975. And through the 70s and 80s, he was a massive part of that band. But in the 80s, he also did quite a lot of solo albums. And those solo albums almost eclipsed the record sales of Genesis. In fact, Phil Collins shares a record, I suppose you would say, with some pretty big artists. Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson and Phil Collins are all in the same club because they're the only three artists that have sold over 100 million albums, both in their solo band and also in their sort of their main band. So obviously Paul McCartney with the Beatles and his solo work, Michael Jackson with Jackson 5 and his solo work, and Phil Collins as his solo work and Genesis. So a mega seller. I mean, in terms of, I'll give you some stats in terms of Phil Collins. In the US alone, he's sold over 35 million albums. In the 1980s, just that decade, he sold over 25 million albums in the US, and he's had an amazing amount of number ones and number one singles and albums. So let's go through some of his singles. Yeah, his working Genesis, worked with other artists, so his career total, he had more than 40 US top singles, more than any other artist in the 1980s. A whole wave of big songs that everyone's heard of. In the UK, I'd almost say in the 80s, there wasn't an adult household that didn't own a Phil Collins album. That was the reach. That was the impact that Phil Collins had in the 1980s. Yes, it got to the point where a lot of people were saying Phil Collins, he's a bit middle of the road, you know, it's a bit sort of adult sort of pop rock, and in the 80s there was, you know, obviously that was quite dominant, but he was a massive artist. I preferred his work in Genesis, to be honest, but there's still some really interesting stuff that he's done as a solo artist. So let's go through the Phil Collins ranking of his 8 studio albums. So in 8th position is his album, which is his last album, and that's Going Back. Now, I was unsure whether to actually include it because it's actually an album full of covers of 60s sort of Motown and soul standards. I never really liked this sort of music that, you know, I know that Phil was well into, and he brought it into a lot of his solo work, that sort of soul and Motown sort of sound. He even crept a little bit into some of the Genesis stuff as well, when, you know, using a lot of horns, you know, things like No Reply at All, and even a little bit of That's All from the sort of self-titled album. It's got a little hint of Motown in it. So Going Back, not really something that I'd want to listen to, so I have to put it in 8th position. In 7th position is Testify, another one of his sort of later albums. This was a return when he started using drum machines again, and it's a much more laid-back sound. But to me, the songs are a little bit weak, and he's still utilising some of those sort of world music elements that he had on those sort of the albums before that as well. The title track, Testify, is probably the best song on the album. And even though we got Daryl Stromer, who came back and collaborated with him on one song, the guitarist, is a sort of country-esque sort of song. The Least You Can Do, it's got some guitar on it at least, you know. But, you know, less said about the sort of laid-back Leo Sayer cover of Can't Stop Loving You. It's very sort of sickly pop. So I'm putting Testify in 7th position. In sixth position, the album that came before that was Dance Into the Light. I mean, it's very sort of upbeat and almost cheerful pop music with an almost sort of, I don't know, Caribbean sort of sound, sort of calypso sort of sound. Obviously, we got more world music elements that he sort of brought into the band at this point, but there's no real standout tracks on this album. So I'm putting Dance Into the Light in sixth. Really, the top five are the ones that you really need to consider. And in fifth position, I'm putting But Seriously. This probably the album came out right at the sort of at the height really of both Phil Collins and Genesis. There's a lot more horns, a bit more jazzier feel to it, and it's a lot more pop rock than than the previous album, or more so than the previous album, No Jacket Required. For me though, it's a little bit too commercial and a little bland. The upbeat songs like are just real at the time top 40 sort of fodder. So you got Hanging Long Enough and Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, and the ballads to me are just a little bit too sickly. So you got Colours, Another Day in Paradise, Father and Son. So for me, this album, I don't rate it as well in terms of his certainly his 80s output. And I think probably the best song on it is I Wish It Would Rain Down, which was the song that he did with Eric Clapton on guitar. That's probably the best song on this album. In fourth position, I'm putting his second album, Hello, I Must Be Going. Now, this is a really good album, actually. It sort of takes some of the sort of pop rock from the album after it, No Jacket Required, with a much more those introspective sort of mood from his sort of debut album, Face Value. The moods and sounds are a little bit all over the place in terms of there's no real sort of strong theme to the album, but there's some really good songs. The key tracks for me are the open I Don't Care Anymore. I think that's a great track. Do You Know, Do You Care, and Through These Walls are all really good tracks, but it's definitely a good album, if a little sort of misguided in terms of what it was trying to achieve. It's almost like the sort of a transitional sort of album between Face Value and No Jacket Required. So I'm putting Hello, I Must Be Going in fourth position. In third position, which is probably a little bit more controversial, but I think it's a really brilliant album, and that's Both Sides. Now, again, this is a real introspective sort of album. He pretty much wrote and performed all the instruments himself. To me, it's the real sort of true follow-up to Face Value. It's got lots of real deep emotion in here, and I think the songs like I've Forgotten Everything, Can't Find My Way, and the 7-minute sort of plus song, We Fly So Close, there's a real personal sort of songwriting here, and I think it's some of the best written songs from a songwriting point of view that Phil Collins has ever done. Even songs like There's a Place for Us and Please Come Out Tonight. I mean, they remind me a little bit of the tracks that George Michael did on his album Older. A lot more sort of laid back, almost like a sort of soft jazz sort of element to it. But as I said, I think it's one of his strongest albums in terms of songwriting. But you've got to be in the mood for it, because it is quite laid back and it's very sort of, it's trying to tug on the heartstrings a lot on this album. So you've got to be in the right mood to really enjoy it. But I'm putting Both Sides in third position. So top two. In second place, No Jacket Required. I mean, this is an album, it's very much of its time, the mid-80s. This is when he became a massive sort of solo artist, really. With this album, though, I don't know whether it's just me, but certainly at the time, it was very much a sort of almost like an album that fathers and sons could enjoy. Certainly my father had this album. I know a lot of my friends of ours that had this album, and we all used to listen to it. We'd go around their houses and we'd be listening to this album. We'd have it on vinyl, this is going back to the 80s when that was it, vinyl. And it seemed to have that real crossover in terms of the sort of demographic that enjoyed that music. It's got a lot of drum machines on it, but all the songs are really sort of, most of the songs are very upbeat and catchy. The songs are strong. I love Only You Know and I Know, and again, with very 80s guitar solo. Daryl Strummer performs really well on this album. There's a sort of almost epic Long Way to Go, and that features Sting from The Police on it. Don't Lose My Number, big electric drum sort of sound, but again, another sort of epic solo by Daryl Strummer. And I think the last three tracks are probably the best ones on it. So you've got the sort of poppier Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore, the sort of quasi ballad Inside Out, which I think is better than the big hit from the album One More Night, and the closer on the album Take Me Home is another great track. it's really, as a whole album, I think it's pretty good. There's not really any sort of low points on that, but it can only make second position for No Jacket Required. And in first position, and I will be surprised if many people sort of disagree with me, but I think that Face Value is his debut album and is also the most complete album by Phil Collins. It's a little bleak, you know, and I think any artist that he starts his solo album, the first song on his first solo album is In the Air Tonight. It's going to be downhill from there because it's a tremendous song, and it's probably the song that he's best well known for. Really, the drumming in that is absolutely superb. But it isn't just a one song album. This, you've got It Must Be Love, The Roof is Leaking, are really great songs. I Missed Again is to some extent the perfect pop song, and it also ends strongly. You know what I mean is really good, and Thunder and Lightning. I'm Not Moving as well. I think the only real misfire on this album is the sort of Genesis song that he reworked, Behind the Lines. I'm not sure whether he came up with Behind the Lines first and Genesis reworked this version, or the other way around. I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments if you know the story behind the Lines. But it appears on the Duke album and No Jacket and Face Value, which I think Duke came out before. I'm sure Duke came out before it. It may have been very similar in terms of dates. I'm sure they were both the same year. So Face Value is my number one Phil Collins album. But what do you think? Do you like Phil Collins? Is he a bit too mainstream pop rock for you? Or do you find that you know there's a lot of good stuff because you're a big fan of Genesis, and so you naturally gravitated towards him? Or like me, I actually got into Phil Collins when I was just a sort of teenager, 12, 13 years old, and Phil Collins was much more dominant in the charts, and I got into him, and then found out he was in this band called Genesis. And that's how I got into that sort of progressive rock music. So for me, it was a great way of finding out about Genesis. But I'm interested to know what you think of Phil Collins. I think his later albums are definitely the poorer ones. His 80s output is definitely the best. But let me know in the comments what you think. Hope you've enjoyed this video. This is Phil Collins. Probably the poppiest side that we'll probably ever go on this channel, because we really do concentrate more on the hard rock and the heavy metal. But I think because of the Genesis albums, and I've had a lot of feedback from the My Genesis ranking. A lot of it's saying that I'm talking rubbish, but so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of you that like Genesis that probably have got an opinion on Phil Collins as a solo artist. Let me know in the comments what your favourite Phil Collins album is. Let me know whether you think that, he should have carried on and done more stuff with Genesis and not done the solo stuff in between. Maybe we would have got more better albums by Genesis. Hope you enjoyed it, and until the next one, keep on rocking.